I'm Paul Hoffschmidt, founder and CEO of Alpha Sophia, and this week I'm joined by Holley Miller, president and founder of Grey Matter Marketing. It's a pleasure to have you on the pod this week, Holly. Maybe at the outset, tell us a little bit about yourself, your journey, and introduce yourself to the audience.
Oh, well, thank you for having me. It's definitely an honor. What about me? So I live in the San Francisco Bay Area, but I'm a Southern girl, kind of born and bred. My During the fall, you'll hear me root for my Alabama football team, so Roll Tide. I am have been in the life sciences space for many decades, but I'm actually have a very funny background in some ways in how I found myself into this space. I was supposed to go to law school after university and realized that that really didn't sound very fun, and so I ended up working in New York City in an advertising agency, and my account was honestly like a tobacco company, so I was selling cigarettes, which just was kind of not very inspiring, and ended up kind of on a whim going to California and saw an ad in the newspaper, which was where you found jobs back then. It was for, I thought, a software company. And I went in for the interview and realized it was the world's first surgical robotic company. And I just, kind of was so inspired and just excited about this idea of technology, minimally invasive surgery and robotics, that I just decided that then and there that this was the space I wanted to be in. And every time I watch TV now and I see like a toilet paper commercial, I think, thank goodness that's not my job, selling these, kind of like consumer product goods that are talking about the scalloped edge of the toilet paper instead of really helping companies bring exciting innovations to the life sciences space that are meaningfully advancing the standard of care and advancing healthcare. So I'm really glad they ended up where I did.
Yeah, and actually that's quite funny. I think the first in-depth touch point I had with MedTech was when a couple of years back when I was visiting a training facility from Intuitive for their Da Vinci system to train surgeons, and I found it just so impressive to see that technology at work and how it works and how surgeons interact with that and how it helps them with yeah delivering
So
better, more precise patient results. Yeah.
that was my first company. Yeah, basically, there were two companies. Our small company got acquired by Intuitive, but that was my first 5 years, which was an incredible journey of, inventing surgeries, traveling around the world, really trying to help bring something that was kind of a crazy idea at the time, but now is the darling of the med tech industry, and people are now wondering how could we possibly unseat the king of robotics. But a lot of companies are very interested in trying. So to your
Yeah.
point, it was a great experience.
And it's, I mean, and like always, like those pioneering companies, they also pave the way for many other companies who then maybe focus on a certain therapeutic field, on I don't know, soft tissue or other things. And there always needs to be that first company who breaks into the market, creates a lot of trust in a new technology category to then pave the path for further companies going down that route.
It's true, and I think it is a very exciting time in the healthcare space and life sciences space where there have been a lot of companies that had ideas, but technology is kind of catching up to some degree. So we're seeing a lot of growth in computing, AI, just lots of different gene editing. Like it's a very exciting time in terms of what we are capable of doing now. That seemed almost like science fiction years ago, but now it's a reality.
Yeah, it's just crazy how things. It's always like change seems really slow when you at a given moment in time, but then if you look back a couple of years, you're just amazed by how much things have changed and have progressed. It's always also a little bit my personal framework about checking whether our company or I personally are doing progress by always basically looking back a year or 5 years and then saying, would I have been happy with the result where I stand today if I knew about that a year or 5 years ago? Would I have signed up to that reality I'm currently in? And that always is a good mirror to check whether you are actually doing progress or not. Because in your constant day-to-day work, it sometimes seems like very, very, very many small steps, and it's hard to measure that on a daily basis.
It's true. I feel like sometimes we don't give ourselves credit for the small wins. and you're waiting for the breakthrough. But someone reminded me a long time ago that you actually go farther with a base hit instead of waiting for that home run. So don't be afraid to kind of chip away and look for those small wins, because a lot of companies I think that are making the most impact, they take a very whiteboard kind of clean canvas type of look, which is let's really challenge the status quo. Let's challenge, like, what if, let's be
Mm,
crazy. Like, what if, why do patients have to be inside the hospital to have their blood, their vitals monitored? Why does the surgeon have to be in the operating room to operate on a patient? Like, the companies that really challenge that premise of what's possible and not, I think are the ones that really shake up things and really create the most innovation and progress versus the companies that are trying to make incremental improvements. And I think we had for a while kind of gotten to that loop of it seemed just incremental. And so I applaud the
mm.
companies that are really out there challenging, what we think is possible and almost unshackling themselves from the constraints that they find today and really letting themselves envision a different world and then finding ways to get there versus, hey, we're just going to move a little bit, a little bit
Mm.
further forward. So I think it's a great time.
I couldn't agree more. Maybe let's talk a little bit about your current company you founded, Gray Matter Marketing. So you described Gray Matter Marketing as a life sciences category design firm. How would you explain that to a layperson, what that
I,
is?
I always call it the mom test because my mom's not in the healthcare space and she's like, "What do you do?" All these years later, she still asks me that question. I think the simplest way I think about it is we offer life sciences companies a blueprint that uses brain science to help them stand out in the market and make the competition irrelevant. And the business strategy is really as simple as creating a new space or a new category that you can own. And the reason why that's so important is because companies that do that have been proven to grow revenue 4 times faster and
Mm.
market cap 6 times faster than the traditional kind of approach to sales. So you have to be able to stand out, devalue what exists in the market, and really get people to change their behavior. And the result, again, is not just advancing healthcare, but materially, exponentially improving your financial health as well as a company.
Very interesting. And how does it translate in projects? So what's the typical project you do with your customers, or is it more like a long-term engagement where you constantly work with them? What are typical customers you work with? Just to flesh that out a little bit, how that then translates into client work you're doing.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. I would say that it's a very common question we get, which is like, well, are we the right company for you? And I would say the companies that we tend to work with most often are probably in three buckets. One, they might be more pre-commercial, a startup. They're trying to launch a new product they think is going to be addressing an unmet need or really kind of shake up things and advance the status quo. Another company might be commercial. They have maybe a product in market, but they're getting ready
Mm,
to launch something, a new product, new line extension, get a new indication. Or you have companies, frankly, that are in market, but they're just not getting they're kind of having an anemic market reaction to their product. So the
mm,
adoption is slow, revenue is unreliable, and they can't figure out why because they think their product is amazing. And they just can't figure out why it's being perceived in the market as more of a nice to have versus a must have. And that is the premise of category design, which is what we do with our clients. And so we work with them almost as a consultant, and we help them identify a compelling narrative, both for the company and for their key stakeholders, whether that's investors, clinicians, patients, what have you. Oftentimes it's all of those people. But the premise is as simple as what's an urgent problem that you can solve that if you did would have a transformational outcome for people that you can uniquely solve. And if you can't really identify a category problem that people care about, an audience or a segment that really has this problem or experiences the problem most acutely, and
mm,
then how do you essentially solve that for them, cure that for them in a way that would transform their lives, you're really probably going to find yourself stuck in that anemic kind of market growth. You're a nice to have. People don't seem
mm.
that interested in using your product or prescribing your product, and so the engagements we have kind of three buckets, if you will. One can just be helping companies identify those three questions and give them a blueprint to just take it and execute or implement themselves. The second scenario is we really help you put in the foundational elements, again, that a company could take with them internally and try to execute. Or one is kind of like we do it all. We do all the strategy, we do the execution. What I found is that most companies in the life sciences, they have a very lean team, honestly, and people are very busy, and companies often are focusing on more of the R&D aspects, the clinical regulatory aspects and sales. But the area that I think that is suffering the most and companies need the most help in is what we call market conditioning, which is how do you really teach the market to think differently and recognize they have a problem that they really would be well served to solve, and then teach them, I actually thought I needed, a blue pen, but I actually need a pair of scissors. They're two different things. Instead of a blue pen or a black pen, it's like, which tool, which instrument do I really need to achieve my goals? And then they're primed for your innovation, your new drug, your new device, your new procedure, and they're more likely to reject what they're currently doing, embrace something new, and then advocate for it because they recognize how transformational this will be. And so in some ways it's kind of helping the market work for you, but stacking the cards in your favor to either have a successful product launch or to accelerate your adoption in the market.
And that's interesting. I mean, that framework basically describes, to my understanding, to create an environment where your potential customers are already educated about the problem you're trying to solve and how you're trying to address that. And then basically only start with that actual sales process once your potential customer base is already warmed up to a level where they have a good foundation or base understanding about all those key factors. And then you can actually start engaging with them in a more in-depth discussion about your product and your commercials and so on.
Correct. I think there's two great points you just touched on. One is that we call it problem marketing, which is it's not about your product. We know you can't, there are definitely constraints around marketing a product in advance of commercial clearance, but educating the market about the problem, what's missing, what would you like to solve, is a huge opportunity. The other point, which you alluded to, maybe you didn't recognize it, is that not everyone has the same problem. So you have to really understand the market to recognize which segment or subsegment really experiences this most acutely. The example we often give when we're doing workshops initially with clients is if you think about going to the airport and you have a plane to catch. If I'm a CEO of a life sciences company and I have a meeting, I'm going from San Francisco to Chicago, I really have to be in Chicago at 10 o'clock for a board meeting. If you cancel my flight, I'm going to be very, very upset. If I just have to sit in the center seat, middle seat, I don't really care. It's an annoyance. But if you cancel my flight and I miss the board meeting, I'm going to really care. And if you do it enough, I'm going to change from United Airlines to Delta, for instance. But if I'm a college student or university student and you cancel my flight, but you give me a $500, travel credit, I might be delighted because I'm a poor college student and so I can use that for another holiday. And so I may not care so much about the, that disguster, we call it the category problem. And so really recognizing who's going to really have the most acute, who's going to experience this problem most acutely, that's your target audience. And you can find that out in various ways. You might be able to work with a company like Alpha Sophia and really understand who's currently in this space, who's currently using this technology or writing these prescriptions. It could be with just qualified research. It could be looking at the patient population that that they're treating. So there's lots of ways to do this. But if any company thinks they should go after the biggest market, they're usually wrong. Because I've just never seen any application, again, whether it's a device, drug, or diagnostic, that everyone experiences the same. There's always a subsegment that experiences at a much higher acute level and therefore be more motivated to change their behavior, reject what they're currently doing, and embrace something new.
And that also translates into a strategy which is probably go deep before you go wide, right?
Correct.
And focus on really nail a problem before you try to I don't know, be average in many problem solutions you try to offer. And I fully agree. I always thinking about, and it translates into everything. It translates into how do you design your product and which features you prioritize, but then also in go-to-market strategy. It might not be the right strategy to try to tackle the whole US market on day one, but maybe focus on centers of excellence on the East Coast first or in a specific state, and then really create a cohort of really happy customers, which you then can leverage to have references for further rollout activities and so on.
It's so true, and I think that it's almost like a battle we sometimes fight with our clients because it just feels like you're giving up, a massive amount of market and potentially revenue. But the truth of the matter is, as you wisely said, if you can really pinpoint a subsegment that you can dominate and own, you'll find ways to get bigger. I mean, the company you mentioned, Intuitive Surgical, they really hung their hat on one surgery. It was a radical prostatectomy. That's it. That's it. And they offered a benefit which was nerve sparing, which would potentially reduce incontinence and impotence for men. And people really cared. Men really cared about that. And that was their
Mm,
foundation. The competitor at the time, there was a competitor to Intuitive for a number of years. They were focusing on a cardiac bypass procedure, much harder and a much more complex regulatory pathway. And Intuitive said, hey, this is our beachhead and we're going to start here. And now
mm,
I think there's some statistic like there's a Da Vinci procedure done every 5 seconds or something crazy like that. But they
mm,
started with a very specific clinical application. And the same is with, Amazon. They were an online bookstore, now they have AWS, which is, their own kind of business entity, which is worth millions and
mm.
millions and millions of dollars. But they just started really with one simple premise of who wants to buy online books.
Yeah, I do agree. And you're already touching on one of the main questions many of our customers and users have, which is they've built a product, and then the question is, they then usually find out, or they've already found out. I mean, customers don't just come inbound, yeah. I mean, that might happen later, but it doesn't that usually doesn't happen in the beginning. So how do you actually connect with your target audience and then convince them to change their behavior to start adopting your product? Do you have a framework you have to think about that, or what are the questions you usually ask your clients when they come with a broad question like that for you?
And so is the question, how do you connect with your target audience once you recognize who that audience is, essentially?
Exactly, exactly, yeah.
It's a great question because I think a lot of companies think it's quite simple. Like we're going to go target urologists, for instance, or we're going to target cardiosurgeons. But I think the truth of the matter is, going back to the idea of like, not everyone experiences things the same way. So having to really, fine tune your, kind of narrow your target audience. So the way we look at it is if you know the problem you can solve, you know who has that
Mm,
problem most acutely, then the question as you're asking is how do you intersect with them most efficiently and most effectively? And I
mm,
think a lot of times companies feel that, well, surgeons or doctors are different human beings. So like we can't, we shouldn't advertise, we shouldn't do these things because they're different. The funny thing I think is, guess what? Surgeons and doctors, they're human beings. Their brain works the same as yours and mine. And there's no kind of secret sauce for a surgeon or a doctor or a nurse that's different than the secret sauce for a teenager or a mom or someone shopping for a car. It's all
mm,
the same. And I think the quicker you understand that people make decisions based on instincts and emotions, they then rationalize it with data and yeah, data and it's one of these things where the faster you realize that, the more you'll be able to accelerate your commercial growth because of
mm,
two fundamental reasons. One is that our brains use shortcuts, cognitive biases, because our brains are actually quite lazy. And so the more choices we have, the less likely we are to make a change. There, that's one. The other thing is that we think we're excellent and smart individuals. So I'm making good choices. If you tell me I'm doing a bad job, I'm going to actually find reasons to dig in and claim that what I'm doing currently is the best. And so getting me to change is actually quite hard. And
mm,
so many companies try to lead with data. They say we have the best clinical data. We did a double blind, trial. We have, 25 clinical studies that have been randomized and look at all different patients. and they lead with the data, but
Mm,
they're not recognizing that the first step is trying to uncover what is that pain point that someone once solved, or if you solve for them, would actually create transformative results. Then you can give them the data because that helps them justify it. And
mm,
companies and clients really dig in their heels and they say, well, we have the best data, we showed superiority. But that in of itself is not enough to get a surgeon, a doctor, a nurse, anyone to change their behavior. And so we
mm,
really try to tell them if you've honed in on something that's really important, it won't take a lot of effort to get them to be open to the idea of trying something. And
mm,
so, for instance, we have a client that's in the lumbar fusion space, and they have actually the best data, but they're the 351st product in this particular market. So if there's 350 other options as a an
mm,
orthopedic surgeon or a neurosurgeon, like why do I need your product? Clearly, spinal fusion has been going on for decades. But when we realize that the category problem that these surgeons find themselves struggling with is it takes a long time for a patient's spine to fuse. And if you don't get good
mm,
fusion, the procedure will fail and the patient will be in a lot of pain and have to come back for a reoperation. So even though the surgeon's
mm,
doing the best they could possibly do with all the tools that they have and they're getting good outcomes eventually, if you give them a lever they never had, which is what if you expedited that from 2 years to 6 months, they're like, that would be amazing. I just didn't think that
mm,
was an option. I just thought that's how long it takes. And so looking for ways to solve problems, they don't need you to be like, let me give you the 800 studies that show this. They just recognize that's an amazing lever I've never had before
mm.
that I can pull now. And they'll just believe what you believe because they're like-minded. Of course, they
Yeah.
will need to submit your clinical data to the VAC committee at the hospital to get your bone graft, accelerator approved. But the idea is the data is not what you need to lead with, and it's a very upside down way to approach commercialization of products because
Mm,
it seems opposite of what people tend to really hold on to, which is data. And I
mm.
think that I'm not discounting clinical trials. I'm just saying that I think companies have to recognize what role that really plays. And if they can really hone in on an urgent problem that would transform outcomes, it's not that hard of a sell.
Okay, med device folks, picture this. What if you could open up a CRM today and it already contained information for every potential lead for you in the country? And you could narrow down those leads further by looking at billing, location, seniority, so much more. Alpha Sophia is the strategy tool that we wish we had had when we were commercializing a medical device in the US market. But there's nothing stopping you. So visit alphasophia.com and learn more.
For me, experience in that market and having worked with many companies and then witnessed even more in that industry over the course of the last years, what would you say are examples of companies who had a successful or great commercial strategy or who did something a little bit different and then were able to capture a market much faster than anticipated or how other companies in that space did it before them. Do you have like a few examples where you always say, "Oh, that's really a North Star. They really did a few things right."
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think some are smaller companies, maybe you've never heard of.
Mm,
We have a client that went from a very large adult population focus, this is in the neuromodulation space, to pediatric indication, more of a focus, and it allowed them to double their revenue, just in
mm,
less than a year. And so I think in those cases, they perceived they were giving up 75% of the market, which is the adult. But the truth of the matter is they were able to find that strategic beachhead and accelerate their growth in 1 year, even though they've been on the market since 2019, And so I think those
mm,
are some smaller examples. There are other examples of companies that I think have done a really good job of taking this, honing into this idea of what already exists in the market from a technology perspective and how
Mm,
can we essentially apply that in a new way. And so Shockwave Medical, I think, is a great example.
mm,
They were acquired by J&J for, I think, something like $13 billion, really with an old technology. So the Shockwave team spent years adapting a technology to a cardiovascular innovation, and they essentially took something that existed and applied it in a new way, and they
mm,
created huge value that was very, very attractive. And they went public in 2024, and I think was acquired, like I said, by J&J and
mm,
for $13 billion. So I think it shows up in different ways. It's just a matter of, I think, trying to find your killer app, some way that people are recognizing that you have are solving something for them. The other thing that I think is a big factor is that the new healthcare economy that companies are trying to commercial products in, it's really different. And I think we have to
mm,
acknowledge that you have an aging population that's getting more complex to treat. You have a shortage of healthcare workers. You have payer pressures to, advance value-based care, reduce costs. You have reimbursement going down. You have potentially tariffs happening because a lot of medical devices and drug companies are um, acquiring manufacturing components either
mm,
from OUS or they're manufacturing OUS. So all these dynamics are changing. But the companies that recognize these are leading to opportunities, I think do very
mm,
well. So we'll talk about for a brief second the GLP-1 space.
mm,
For decades, the options were really weight loss with the drugs, or dieting, or bariatric surgery. Those are kind of the two options.
mm,
Uh, the drugs are difficult to tolerate. They often, dieting has also shown that within 5 years you gain back all your weight. Weight loss surgery is hugely effective, not just for weight loss, but also for resolution of type 2 diabetes. But a lot of people don't want to have surgery. So the GLP-1
mm,
companies, the Wegovy's, the Ozempics, they realize that what if we can approximate or get the body to essentially work like bariatric surgery, but without surgery?
mm,
And that became a massive market that we've all been exposed to the last few years. But the companies that recognized this change in context, that essentially said, how do we create a distribution network to allow patients to get access to this? So you saw a lot of the rise of the virtual health companies that are focusing on,
mm,
distributing, prescribing, rather, I should say, these types or these classifications of drug. These are the companies I think that are being very sharp with respect to recognizing a shift in context can also open the door
mm,
and create massive opportunities, not just for companies financially, but really to scale distribution and access to care that a lot of people don't
mm,
need. There's something like 100 doctors in the United States that specialize in obesity. That's it. That's less than
mm.
two in a state, if you even have one in your state. So the idea of scaling access is a huge opportunity that companies have been very wise with. So I think these examples are all around. But if you look under the hood, you'll find that they leaned into a change in context and found a specific audience that they could solve a problem for, which created a transformative outcome versus trying to sell basically the same product. Maybe it's a little bit cheaper. Maybe it has an extra feature that's new, but really no one
Mm,
cares. No one really cares about that.
mm.
It's a nice to
Yeah.
have at best. And I think that's kind of the litmus test. If companies are having a hard time getting traction in the market, I suspect it's because the audience views it to be a nice to have problem or a nice to have
Mm.
product.
Yeah, it's interesting. And as you're going through those examples, I mean, just thinking about the good old textbook marketing mix of, I don't know, product, packaging, pricing, promotion, and so on. It's not like you do have to change every of those factors, but you have to do one thing really right and adapt to a shift, as we were elaborating, and really hit the nail with one thing is much better than, I don't know, changing a lot of things slightly and just being only perceived as being a little bit of incremental in an existing market. Um, no, that's interesting. That's an interesting way of thinking about that. I think at Grey Matter Marketing, you've also coined that phrase of a category king. which probably then describes someone who does exactly that, right?
Yeah, it's a great question because I think a lot of companies want to be dominant in their space. They want to be market leaders for a lot of reasons, especially if you have an innovation, a truly innovative product or treatment or therapy. The premise, of course, is that will improve patient outcomes, right? That's everyone's goal. That's why we work in this space. So I think the companies that really do it well, they have been more disciplined in being focused. And I think that they understand how to communicate and connect with those audiences in a way that's very different from most people. Most companies think, well, if I just have the perfect ad campaign and put it out there, just post more on LinkedIn, that's going to magically improve our outcomes. Or they might say, look, we just need to hire more sales reps. That's how we scale our commercial business. But I think the truth of the matter is the companies that really recognize who to talk to and how to intersect with them, I think are the ones that are most successful. A lot of companies we talk to spend millions and millions of dollars going to trade shows and events, whether they're society meetings, medical conferences, or just places they feel like they have to show up. But I would challenge them. What's really the return on your investment for those events and those shows? I think most begrudgingly go. They feel like I have to show up at this medical conference because this is where our audience is. But the truth of the matter is, that may not be the most effective way to engage your audience. And I think having this concept of it isn't necessarily, you can't win just by your sales reps being in the market. You can't win just on price. The products that are truly differentiated, you can charge a premium for them. And I think that's the most enviable position for companies to be in. They just feel like if I'm competing, they don't have grounds to do that because they can't actually offer, they can't be a premium because they're basically the same thing. And so I think a lot of companies have to rethink how they might traditionally go after marketing and sales because it just doesn't work as well. You can either double down or you can make adjustments, because right now we're seeing that most companies, less than 17% of their sales reps are hitting their quotas each quarter. That means that the projections you had for revenue are very unstable. 70% of earnings guidance companies are giving is wrong. So it shows you that the traditional kind of historical way of commercializing and scaling a company is just not as effective anymore. Things have changed. Again, the new healthcare economy has changed. And so I think the companies that take a step back and recognize there's, what's the most effective and efficient way to intersect with their audience, the right audience, and educate them about what's missing, they're more likely to embrace it. And then they can hopefully reduce the amount of marketing and sales spend that they're, burning, whether that's human capital, financial capital, and recognize that sometimes doing less is actually going to create a much more powerful outcome, and maybe rethinking what's really going to work at the end of the day. The sales rep relationship is not as powerful in the new kind of healthcare economy. And so how are you really going to intersect and teach your audience what's missing and that they should reject the status quo and embrace something new?
Yes, I think the biggest risk when doing business generally, but especially in healthcare, is when companies don't question things just because they've always been that way. As you mentioned, we always went to trade shows. That we are just going to continue. That's like a given. Yeah, we always have the model of scaling revenue by hiring just more sales reps in every state, in every city, and so on. And I think there's great value when you go back to first principles and think about, okay, if I would design that from bottom up again, yeah, what would we do? What could help us with our specific product / business model / sales and marketing strategy to connect with our potential customers in a, first of all, most efficient way, but then also effective way where you actually are able to get the attention of those busy doctors and be able to convince them that there's an advantage in how you approach a certain problem and so on.
The first question we always ask is, what problem do you solve? And it sounds so simple, but we spend the most time with our clients going through this kind of foundational strategy on that one question. And we have a kind of a grid that has four quadrants, and one is a delighter, one's nice to have, the top left is disguster, and then the bottom left is annoyance. And when we ask, like, why should someone use your product or buy your product, a lot of times the problem that they hone in on is an annoyance or a nice to have. But what we found is that, going back to the airline example, if you might delight me by giving me an upgrade to business class when I fly, but if you cancel my flight and I never get there, it doesn't matter what seat I'm in because I never got to my meeting. And so if you cancel my flight, I'm going to stop flying United, for instance. And so I think a lot of companies believe that by focusing on the things that delight customers, that's where the wins are. But the truth is, loyalty and advocacy comes in addressing the disgusters first. And so we always say, like, if you can't solve a problem that people really care about, then you're never going to find yourself, frankly, in a category king opportunity position of really owning and dominating a category. And so one of the first things we do is, a lot of companies, as you can imagine, like, they're already in market. They've already gone through the regulatory process, so they can't, like, invent something different. Like, their labeling is their labeling, their indication is their indication. But we can help them finding a different problem you can solve or a different audience you can solve. And so I always go back to that question: is what urgent problem can you solve? And you just have to keep going, keep going, keep going. And 100% of the time, the outcome is different than what people thought it was going into it. So, you might think that the problem you solve is safety, but if your audience is like, the products we currently use, we've figured out how to use them, we're not that worried about safety, like, you got to find something else. And so I think it's very quickly and easy to see, is our problem really a disguster, or is it annoyance, or is it a nice to have? And I think that's, like, the easiest lens that a company of any size at any stage can ask themselves is, do we actually solve a disguster? Do we actually solve a canceled flight for our CEOs of busy companies? Or do we just guarantee them more legroom?
Yeah, that's really well said, and I think that's a great framework. Now, it also started spinning in my head about how we think about our company and how we can improve on those dimensions to further solve more of those issues where people really care about, and yeah, when we build further products down the road. Um, Maybe to look a little bit into the future. What are the most exciting trends you see in life sciences at the moment? And I think you also conducted some research last year and published a report with Grey Matter Marketing, and maybe you can dive a little bit into that and yeah, tell the audience what the most interesting results from that are, and what was unexpected, what was expected from that research.
Yeah. As I mentioned earlier, I think it's a really exciting time in the life sciences space. And so I think there's kind of two things that struck me. One is that, as I mentioned, there's a new healthcare economy. So what worked in the past, like, it's just is not proving to be as effective. And so that's not going to change. Like, magically overnight, we're not going to have, a surplus of doctors. We're not going to have uh, healthier patients. We're not going to have more reimbursement coming through. Like, it's just not happening. And so companies can either make adjustments and adjust their sales, and like a sailboat, not sales like they're, SALE, but SAIL, adjust their sales and adjust to this new healthcare economy and find success. Or they can double down and continue to be very frustrated with their outcomes. And that was the thing that I thought was most interesting in the market, which is why Grey Matter conducted the 2024 Life Sciences C-Suite report, because we wanted to qualify and quantify what's really happening in the market to really educate companies about this gap in, kind of market performance and how to be successful. Because what I was getting frustrated by was meeting companies and CEOs of life sciences that had really great ideas, but they were not seeing the light of day. They couldn't get market traction, they couldn't get funding. And I thought, like, there's got to be a different way that we can educate people, not just to how do they tell their story and how do they kind of go to market in a way that will be successful, but also how do we help companies scale if they're already in the market. And so part of it was validating these assumptions. I mentioned one earlier, which was not even 20% of companies have sales reps that are hitting their quota for the last three
Mm.
quarters. So like if your sales reps aren't able to get their quotas, you're clearly not going to be able to hit your revenue numbers, and that can have grave implications.
And I mean, it also has many knock-on effects. Yeah, if your sales reps are not hitting quota, they're not making the earnings personally that they are expecting. They are less happy, and I mean, it creates an environment where the whole company is really unsatisfied with the performance, and that's going to lead to employee churn at some point, which is going to hurt every company, and
And
so on. So, I mean, if
reductions in R&D investments, to your point, like all these
yeah,
things that hinge upon revenue. Yeah. The other interesting thing was in the research report we did, the other interesting thing that we found was that while most CEOs of life sciences companies believe that product differentiation was the most powerful lever, essentially, to
mm,
grow revenue and scale revenue, more than half of them were competing, meaning they were essentially an incrementally similar product. And so if you're really hanging your hat on differentiation, but you're not differentiated, it also speaks to why there's a disconnect between reliable revenue
mm,
and market performance, because you're not that different. And I think, again, it goes back to companies have to either solve something differently for a different audience, but you have to be differentiated. If you're not, you're just the same, and there's really no
mm.
motivation for a doctor or a surgeon or a nurse to reject what they're currently doing and change their behavior. So differentiation has to be king. I think in terms of what's really exciting on the horizon, I think there's two kind of areas that have piqued my interest. One is the endoluminal space. Surgery is very effective, but it can be very traumatic. The endoluminal space is this idea of, well, why can't we do more complex surgeries and procedures and interventions without really accessing and cutting open the body? And I think in many
Mm.
ways we've been very limited of where we can access in the bodies. And so I think this is a very exciting new space. It's combining endoluminal intervention and robotics. So I'm really excited about that. The other space that I think is very underfunded and it's a mistake is femtech. And fem
Mm.
health, which is this idea of women are the half the population. We make the healthcare decisions for our families and for ourselves as individuals. But most of the companies and most of the clinical trials, frankly, are white, middle-aged, men. And so
Mm.
this idea of we've got to change this dynamic to really help improve major health conditions and disease states that are being essentially neglected. So I think women's health and endoluminal surgeries and robotic endoluminal surgeries are really kind of exciting new spaces to explore.
Yeah, I could not agree more, and that's something which, I mean, that has prevailed for decades, and I think that discussion is increasing. That this is a miscondition that should not be there. Yeah, you should have really yeah, equity when it comes to how clinical trial groups are being set up, and also not only in that clinical trial stage, that's oftentimes too late. Yeah, you already want to do product innovation for all sorts of product and patient cohorts and groups in society. Yeah, that has a lot to do also with where funding is going, yeah, where innovations are being incentivized, how reimbursement structures are. I mean, all those things in healthcare are always intertangled, and you can't solve them only on one end. You really have to have a system adjustment where you make things more equal when it comes to distributions of resources. Um, and I think in terms of looking into the future, I mean, I think one thing which I hope is going to help is when the world is, especially in healthcare, is working closer together in innovation, and innovation not only comes from one part of the world, but is being developed in multiple parts. But then those innovations and products are being used across the world that can help a lot to solve for that in the next couple of years. Um, Maybe one last closing question for you with Gray Matter Marketing. What's going to be your focus over the coming year or the coming month? Do you have any initiatives up on the horizon?
We're about to launch our 2025 C-suite State of the Life Sciences C-suite report as a continuation from our 2024 report. So that's coming out probably in April, early April. So if you're interested in that, please let me know. I'd be happy to send anyone an advance copy. But again, that's our gift to the industry to really help them understand what's happening in the marketplace and having some actionable strategies to compete and win and hopefully dominate your market. I think there's, again, so many great ideas out there and so many companies that I am excited to see them come to fruition in the market
Mhm.
and really find a foothold and really take off. And so that's our goal, is to try to help as many companies as possible have a successful commercial launch and commercial adoption. And again, that could be companies that are pre-commercial or companies that are even in market. So I think it's going to be a great year. I'm very excited.
Sounds like an exciting year, and I really wish you and Grey Matter Marketing the best of success this year. I think our conversation really, yeah, created a lot of head spinning in my head, thinking about the frameworks you shared, which I think are really valuable. So, Holly, thanks a lot for joining us today. It was great having you on the pod.
Thank you. It was an honor to be here, a lot of fun. And it's always great to talk to like-minded people that are really talking about what's the most effective way to scale your company at a lower cost. So it's been a ball. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Simple question. Can you afford to have a rep in every county, or do you need to be hyper targeted in your outreach? Do you need to know information about your targets going in to be successful, or do you have years and years before you want to close that deal? If you want to be focused, if you want to deliver fast, you should visit alphasophia.com and help your sales team out.